end the vast, brutal struggle on the Eastern Front. One weapon cast a long, cold shadow over every German soldier. The T-34 tank. Its sloped armor deflected shells. Its wide tracks conquered mud and snow. It was faster, more adaptable, and built in staggering numbers. But, as the German blitzkrieg tore deep into the Soviet Union in 1941, seizing factories and decimating industrial heartlands, a desperate question faced the Kremlin: where would they build enough of these formidable machines to survive? The answer lay not in the famed industrial complexes of the West, but in a secret, unprecedented exodus to a place no enemy reconnaissance could fathom. This is the story of the secret factory that built Russia's most feared tank. By late September 1941, the situation was catastrophic. Army Group Center was driving on Moscow. In the south, the titanic battle for Kiev had just ended in a Soviet disaster. The Kharkiv locomotive plant, Factory No. 183, one of the primary birthplaces of the T-34, was directly in the path of General von Kleist's panzers. Its capture was imminent. The order came not from the People's Commissariat of Defense, but from the State Defense Committee, signed by Stalin himself: evacuate. Not just the blueprints, not just the managers, but everything. Every lathe, every press, every crane, and every worker. They were to move a mammoth tank factory thousands of miles east, to a location so remote it was marked on few maps: the Ural Mountains. End the vast, brutal struggle on the Eastern Front. One weapon cast a long, cold shadow over every German soldier. The T-34 tank. Its sloped armor deflected shells. Its wide tracks conquered mud and snow. It was faster, more adaptable, and built in staggering numbers. But as the German blitzkrieg tore deep into the Soviet Union in 1941, seizing factories and decimating industrial heartlands, a desperate question faced the Kremlin: where would they build enough of these formidable machines to survive? The answer lay not in the famed industrial complexes of the West, but in a secret, unprecedented exodus to a place no enemy reconnaissance could fathom. This is the story of the secret factory that built Russia's most feared tank. By late September 1941, the situation was catastrophic. Army Group Center was driving on Moscow. In the south, the titanic battle for Kiev had just ended in a Soviet disaster. The Kharkiv locomotive plant, Factory No. 183, one of the primary birthplaces of the T-34, was directly in the path of General von Kleist's panzers. Its capture was imminent. The order came not from the People's Commissariat of Defense, but from the State Defense Committee, signed by Stalin himself: evacuate. Not just the blueprints, not just the managers, but everything. Every lathe, every press, every crane, and every worker. They were to move a mammoth tank factory thousands of miles east, to a location so remote it was marked on few maps: the Ural Mountains. The protagonist of this story is not a single soldier, but a collective: the thousands of engineers, factory workers, and laborers of Factory No. 183, led by its hard-driving director, Yuri Maksarev. These men and women had already been working triple shifts under the glare of arc lights, the skeletons of T-34s taking shape around them to the constant thunder of German artillery drawing nearer each day. They were building the very machines that were trying to hold the line at the front, even as that line collapsed towards them. The strategic situation made their task the fulcrum of the war. Soviet tank production in 1941 was in freefall. The loss of the Western factories would be a death blow. The only solution was what the Soviets called the evacuatia, the Great Evacuation. An entire industrial civilization was to be picked up and moved beyond the Ural Mountains, out of reach of the Luftwaffe. Factory No. 183 was the crown jewel of this effort. The T-34 was the weapon that could match, and often best, the German Panzer Is and IVs. Without a continuous, massive supply of them, the Red Army would be bled white. The destination was a small, unremarkable city called Nizhny Tagil. Here, an existing railroad car plant, Uralvagonzid, was to be transformed, merged with the evacuated Kharkiv plant, into a new, gargantuan production complex. It was given a cryptic, impersonal designation, Ural Tank Factory No. 183. Its location was a state secret. Its output would be a military secret. Its very existence was to be obscured from the world. The workers, many of whom had never left Ukraine, were told they were going on a journey to save the motherland. They boarded trains not knowing their final destination, the scale of the task ahead, or the unimaginable hardships they would face. Their journey was into the unknown, with the fate of a nation riding in their freight cars. The evacuation began under fire. In the cold autumn rains of October 1941, the first of over 1,500 freight trains was loaded. This was not an orderly relocation. This was a surgical extraction under combat conditions. Pause cranes, some weighing hundreds of tons, were disassembled by workers who often lacked proper tools. Massive stamping presses were carefully unbolted from concrete foundations. Precision machine tools, the heart of tank production, were crated in wooden boxes lined with straw. Blueprints, technical schematics, and gauges were packed into steel cases, guarded like state treasure. By November, the German vanguard was on the outskirts of Kharkiv. The final trains departed as the sound of small arms fire echoed through the industrial district. Behind them, demolition teams worked feverishly to ensure nothing of value remained for the enemy. The last workers left their homes, not knowing if they would ever return. The journey east was a harrowing ordeal in itself. The trains, packed with machinery and people, crawled across a vast landscape choked with other refugee trains, military supply transports, and troop movements. Food was scarce. The bitter cold of the Russian winter now setting in, seeped into the unheated boxcars. Meanwhile, in Nizhny Tagil, a parallel drama of impossible scale was unfolding. The existing Eurovagazit facility was wholly inadequate. Under the direction of the People's Commissariat of Tank Industry, an army of construction workers, many of them women, teenagers, and prisoners from the Gulag system, began to erect a new factory. They worked in temperatures that plunged to -40 degrees Celsius. They lived in dugouts, mud huts, and overcrowded barracks. Hunger was constant. Dysentery and typhus were rampant. The sheer physical toll was staggering. Narrator, back on the rails, the first trains from Kharkiv began to arrive at the frozen, muddy sidings of the construction site in December 1941. What the evacuees saw would have broken lesser spirits. There was no roof over much of the proposed assembly hall. Walls were incomplete. There was no power grid, no plumbing, no organized foundry. Machine tools sat under tarpaulins in the snow, freezing and rusting. The directive from Moscow, however, was absolute and unforgiving. Begin production immediately. The Red Army was fighting for its life in the snows before Moscow. They needed tanks, not in months, in weeks. And so, they began. Workers unloaded their own machines. They assembled them inside unfinished buildings, their breath fogging in the air, their fingers sticking to frozen metal. They often worked by the light of kerosene lamps. Women and teenagers, trained hastily on the spot, took up welding torches and rivet guns. The chief designer of the T-34, Mikhail Koshkin, had died of pneumonia the previous year. His successor, the brilliant Alexander Morozov, set up his drafting tables in a makeshift office, working day and night to not only continue production, but to simplify the design for faster building. Every component was scrutinized, every process was streamlined. The goal was not perfection, it was volume, it was survival. By January 1942, the situation at the front was still desperate. Leningrad was under siege. The Red Army was planning its winter counteroffensives, but its tank armies were depleted. The pressure on the secret factory was immense. NKVD officials patrolled the floors, their presence a constant reminder of the stakes. Misquotas could mean accusations of sabotage. The workers were driven by a mixture of patriotism, fear, and sheer, gritty determination. They knew the men at the front were dying in the snow. They believed every rivet they drove, every weld they made, could save a life, could turn the tide. The first tank to be fully assembled in Nizhny Tagil, a T-30 from model 1941, rolled off the makeshift line on January 20, 1942. It was built in a building without windows, by workers who were half-starved and freezing. But it ran. The initial triumph of building that first tank gave way to the crushing reality of the task. Producing one tank was a miracle. Producing hundreds, then thousands, on a reliable schedule, seemed beyond comprehension. The crisis was systemic. By March 1942, the factory was a chaotic, sprawling organism struggling to live. The supply chain was in tatters. The railway system was the lifeline, but it was overburdened and vulnerable. The most critical shortage was armor plate. The steel mills in Magnitogorsk, also struggling with their own evacuated equipment and untrained workers, could not produce enough of the high-quality, rolled homogeneous steel needed for the T-34's hull and turret. Trucks laden with subcomponents would get stuck for weeks on the primitive roads of the Urals. Foundries at the new factory complex lacked consistent supplies of pig iron and manganese. Some days, the assembly line simply stopped, not for lack of will, but for lack of a single, crucial part. Within the factory walls, conditions were brutal. Workers labored 12, 14, sometimes 18-hour shifts. They slept on cots next to their machines. The cold was so intense that tool steel could become brittle and shatter. Hunger was a constant companion. The meager food rations were barely enough to sustain physical labor. Illness swept through the barracks. The sound of coughing was drowned only by the relentless pounding of presses and the scream of cutting tools. Yet, the line had to keep moving. Directors like Maxrev received daily, sometimes hourly, telegrams from Moscow demanding updates, demanding more output. The specter of failure was not just professional disgrace, it was treason. Then came the new German threat. In the summer of 1942, as the Wehrmacht launched Operation Blau, driving toward the Volga and the oil fields of the Caucasus, intelligence reached Moscow of new German tank designs. The upgun Panzer IV, with a long 75mm cannon, and rumors of even heavier, more powerful tanks in development. The standard T-34, with its 76.2mm gun, was suddenly vulnerable. The secret factory's output, just as it was beginning to find a rhythm, was at risk of becoming obsolete. Morozov and his design bureau were ordered to integrate a new, more powerful 85mm gun into the T-34 design, and to improve armor and crew ergonomics, all without significantly slowing production. It was like rebuilding an aircraft in mid-flight. The low point came in the autumn of 1942. The Battle of Stalingrad raged, consuming men and machines at a monstrous rate. Trains laden with freshly built T-34s from Nizhny Tagil rolled straight into the combat zone, the crews sometimes meeting their tanks at the railhead and driving them directly into battle. The factory was pushing out over 200 tanks a month, but the demand seemed insatiable. Workers began to collapse at their stations from exhaustion. The quality control issues were inevitable. Some tanks arrived at the front with minor defects, costing precious time and lives to fix. The pressure was breaking the machinery, the system, and the people within it. The secret factory was on the brink, producing wonders yet fraying at the seams, a paradox of immense output and near collapse. The turning point did not come from a single heroic act, but from a revolution in organization and human spirit. It was a cold, systemic efficiency born of desperation. First, the Soviet state unleashed its full bureaucratic might to solve the supply problems. New railway spurs were built with breakneck speed. Armor plate production at Magnitogorsk was prioritized above all else, with engineers from Tank Factory No. 183 sent to assist. A strict, military-style discipline was imposed on logistics. If a part was late, officials were held personally accountable. Inside the factory, a wave of innovation swept the production lines. Morozov's design team achieved the miraculous. They created a new, hexagonal turret for the T-34 that was easier to manufacture and could accommodate the new 85mm gun. This became the iconic T-34-85, but the real revolution was in the building process itself. The Americans, through the Lend-Lease program, supplied thousands of machine tools, advanced press forges, and even entire food packages for workers. More importantly, they provided the concept of the moving assembly line. Soviet engineers adapted it with ruthless pragmatism. Narrator: the factory floor was reorganized into a continuous flow. Instead of building tanks in stationary spots, the holes were placed on sledges and pulled by chains along a track. At each station, a specialized team performed a specific task: mounting the suspension, installing the engine, welding the turret ring. The pace was relentless, dictated by the line itself. The sound became a constant, rhythmic roar of industry. Banners hung from the rafters with slogans: "Everything for the front," and "For the motherland, for Stalin." Socialist competition between work brigades was encouraged. The winning team might get extra rations or a red banner on their station. But the most critical element was the human one. The workers, now settled in slightly better barracks, organized into tight-knit brigades. They took immense pride in their work. A welder named Alexandra Yegorova, who lost her husband at Stalingrad, became famous for welding 3 holes in a single shift, a superhuman feat. Teenagers like 16-year-old Pavel Karpov, operating a massive vertical turret lathe, consistently exceeded his quotas by 150%. These were Stakhanovites of the armaments industry. They were no longer just laborers. They were soldiers on the labor front, and their weapon was industrial output. They worked with a grim, focused fury, knowing that every hour saved on the line meant tanks arriving at the front days sooner. The factory was no longer just a collection of machines and people. It had become a single, living entity, a mighty forge dedicated to one purpose: the production of victory. The results were staggering. From the chaos of 1942, Ural Tank Factory No. 183 emerged as the most productive tank factory in human history. In 1943, the year of the Titanic armored clash at Kursk, the factory produced over 5,600 T-34s. By 1944, it was outputting nearly 7,000 tanks annually. At its peak, the factory was completing a battle-ready T-34 to 85 every 7 hours. The secret city of Nizhny Tagil, a blur of smoke and industry hidden in the Urals, was building more tanks than the entire Third Reich. The legacy of this effort is written in the timeline of the war on the Eastern Front. The vast fleets of T-34s that swarmed at Kursk, that broke through at Operation Bagration in 1944, and that raced into Berlin in 1945, overwhelmingly bore the stamped markings of Factory No. 183. The T-34 became the symbol of Soviet industrial resilience and the backbone of the Red Army's deep battle doctrine. It was not the most sophisticated tank, nor the most comfortable for its crews, but it was the right tank, in the right numbers, at the right time. And it flowed from the Urals in an unending steel river. The human cost within the factory walls was profound. While exact casualty figures from accidents, exhaustion, and disease are not fully recorded, hundreds, possibly thousands, of workers perished. They were not killed by enemy action, but were worn down by the relentless, brutal demands of total war. Their sacrifice was recognized not with combat medals, but with state awards like the Order of the Red Banner of Labor. The factory itself was awarded the Order of Lenin. After the war, the veil of secrecy slowly lifted. The world learned of the Tankograd tank city in the Urals. The evacuees from Kharkov largely remained, their lives permanently intertwined with the city they built from nothing. The story of the secret factory is more than a tale of industrial might. It is a story of a forced migration that saved a nation, of a workforce that became an army, and of a machine that was forged in desperation to become a legend. It stands as a testament to the grim, determined mobilization of an entire society pushed to the absolute brink. A mobilization that, from the frozen mud of an unfinished building, produced the weapon that helped turn the tide of the deadliest conflict in history. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.